This is the story about an amazing, positive man named Gary Gassin, a man who was a good friend to pretty much everyone he met. From what I know about Gary, I know that he would want us to be celebrating right now. He wouldn't want us to be sad or mourning his absence. I mean, can you even remember a time when he wasn't upbeat or cheerful or without a sunny disposition? Not Gary. Even the car he drove was a reflection of his lightheartedness, a lime green VW Beetle. He was a free spirit for sure, and by that, I mean he was a happy soul. And regardless of how you were feeling, he always lifted your spirits with his positive energy, his smile, his expressions like, "Oh no!" or "Oh shoot!" or "Amazing, amazing." I can still hear his voice now. I would like to share the final chapter of Gary's life. Well, his life here on Earth anyway. Gary and I met at a jam-packed airport on our way to Switzerland in September 2016. We were both on a Rhine River cruise trip that was being hosted by the Dublin Chamber. Well, computer nerd that he was, he had memorized all the names of the people on the trip, and about the first words out of his mouth were, "Let me guess, you're Tom, right?" I immediately knew I was going to like him. We were pretty much inseparable throughout that trip. He was ornery and seemed more like a 20-something than a 60-something. His wife Barb is very similar. Both are eternally young at heart. And who doesn't like hanging out with people like that? I took hundreds of photos on that trip, and if you know me, I love taking photos of people. Gary became my favorite subject. While some people shy away from the camera, he would willingly ham it up anytime I'd point the lens his way. We had one day cruising down the Rhine River where we sat on the top deck of the ship as the tour guide described the castles that were passing by. It was unseasonably cold, so the crew gave us blankets to wrap up in. This photo of Gary pretending to be a Muslim woman took first place in the trip photo contest. That's Gary for you. So that's how our relationship began. At the time, I had no idea that God was laying the foundation to bring Gary home. Well, like most of us with busy lives, we stayed in touch off and on via Facebook. I casually invited Gary to join this new philanthropic group called 100 Men that met quarterly. He agreed, and so we would carpool to the meetings, sometimes in a silly green VW Bug and sometimes in my Mustang convertible. We'd typically go out to dinner after the meetings, and we had no problem talking for hours upon end. In fact, more often than not, we stayed until closing time. At the end of one such meeting in December 2018, Gary told me about his cancer diagnosis. Typical Gary, he had already started doing research on the internet, and he said his estimated time remaining was 2.7 years. That was a shock. But what was even more unexpected was what he said next. "Sometime I'd like to talk to you more about your faith. You seem to have a good handle on it, and I trust your perspective," he said. Let me tell you, I was immediately energized. We stayed for at least another hour, discussing some of the typical questions, starting with comprehension of the Trinity. He asked, how could God be all three at once, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? He also told me that as a teenager, he told his parents he had had enough of church, that he wasn't going anymore. Now he wondered if it was too late, if he had somehow missed his chance for salvation. I reassured him it's never too late. Well, this launched us into a two-person Bible study. I got us both a Life Application Study Bible for Christmas in large print for our old eyes. Every Monday we would pick a local pub and have a good conversation over burgers and beers, followed by a lengthy discussion about this week's biblical lesson. In November 2019, my brother-in-law, who is a retired Methodist minister, hosted a men's spiritual weekend retreat at a beautiful mountain resort in Virginia, where they live. I asked Barb if I could borrow Gary for the weekend. She thought that was a good idea. Gary got some more of his questions answered, but the biggest takeaway that weekend was connecting with other men of faith, as you'll see in a minute. Gary wasn't still full in at this point. We had an exercise that weekend where we were to pick out a single word that we were going to embrace for the year ahead. We stamped the word into metal washers that could be used as keychains or soldier-like dog tag necklaces. His word was seeking. Well, as we all know, when 2020 rolled around, our weekly meetings in person became weekly Zoom meetings instead. Gary and I also signed up for a 6 weeks men's Bible study through my brother-in-law's church, the one that had the weekend retreat in Virginia. During one of those meetings, in a Zoom breakout room, something incredible happened. Gary gave his life to Jesus. It was May 12th, 2020. After the meeting was over, Gary and I then talked for several hours on a subsequent Zoom call. I was so excited for him, and he also seemed very rejuvenated by it all. What a momentous day in his spiritual journey that was. After he got off the call with me, I understand he climbed into bed where Barb was already asleep. He nudged her and said, "Hey, guess what?" "What?" she replied. "I said the prayer," he said. And that's all he said. He rolled over and fell fast asleep. Barb found this calendar from some of Gary's papers in his office, where he had written "born again" on that date, and circled it. From that point on, we continued our weekly Bible study. We had planned to go to Promise Keepers in Dallas last summer, but we ended up attending virtually from my home in Dayton instead. Gary's hair was nearly gone from all the chemo treatments, so we fashioned him a 14-pound Maine Coon hat. He always kept a positive attitude, no matter what he was dealing with. In November 2020, Gary stayed overnight at my home, and the next day we drove to the Cincinnati Convention Center to see my daughter take first place in a bodybuilding competition. It was something he always wanted to see, and we lucked out with a picture-perfect day. These are the last good photos I have of Gary before his health started to erode rapidly. The regular Zoom calls and texts slowly diminished. I started making house calls and taking him dinner and checking up on him once a week. Barb and eventually his sister Lisa would give us guy time to catch up, and I'd always do my best to try and reassure him of the great banquet that is ahead of him, of the joyful reunion he could look forward to with his father, his mother, his business partners, perhaps his dog Peanut, and also the sister he never got a chance to meet. Time and time again, we talked about faith by grace alone, not faith by works. Just because he hadn't regularly attended church didn't mean he would be excluded from heaven. I told him, "Gary, you're just like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You've had the ruby slippers on all your life. You've been a good Christian indeed as well. All the lives you've touched, all the volunteering that you've done, you have been a light unto the world. Now all that's left is to click your heels together to get back home. When you're ready, take Jesus' hand and look back over your shoulder and say, 'We'll see you later, because we're all right behind you.' Save me a bar stool in heaven," I joked with him. And before I would leave his bedside, I'd say, "Well, it's about time to go. Anything else I can do for you?" And he would say tearfully, "Pray." And we would pray, giving thanks to God for the time we have here on the planet, and for all the time to be able to say goodbye and to get everything in order, and for comfort and confidence to know that He has something even greater ahead for all of us. I'll close with a quote befitting of Gary. It's from one of the world's greatest philosophers, Winnie the Pooh. It goes like this: "If there ever comes a day when we can't be together, keep me in your heart. I'll stay there forever." Gary, you will always be in our hearts. Thank you for making us smile. You were truly a light unto the world. Rest in peace, my friend.